master's degree in historic preservation program at Ball State's College of Architecture and Planning. Welcome to the first in the 1998-99 College of Architecture and Planning lecture series. This is a series which is put on each year by the college, featuring a variety of speakers. Our speaker tonight will be the first in this year's series, and I was told by Jim Segedy, the coordinator, that former Mayor William H. Hudnut III will be the speaker October 19th. Right. I also would like to alert you to the fact that there's going to be a nice reception put on by the Associated Students for Historic Preservation immediately following the lecture tonight in the college atrium. So you're all cordially invited to that. It's a great personal pleasure for me to introduce tonight's lecture in the lecture series. I have known Reid Williamson for nearly 25 years and count him both as a mentor and a close personal friend. I first met him when the Indianapolis chapter of the American Institute of Architects was assembling a guidebook on Indianapolis architecture. I was freshly graduated from college and working on the historical research for the book, and Reid had just taken over as Executive Director of Historical Landmarks Foundation of Indiana. He supported the guidebook project as a way to increase public awareness about historic landmarks and neighborhoods, and the book became a great success. Since then, Reid and I have worked together on a multitude of preservation projects and issues, some of which you'll probably cover tonight. Through the years, he's given me constant support and encouragement in a variety of jobs, and I'd like to express my appreciation to him tonight for that. Thanks, Reid. Reid Williamson is a graduate of Yale University, and before joining Historic Landmarks, served as a business executive in Atlanta, Georgia, and the founding executive vice president of the Historic Savannah Foundation in Savannah, Georgia. He has a knowledge about the historic preservation movement in the United States and an understanding of the workings of nonprofit preservation organizations that surpasses those of nearly every other professional working in the field. As head of Historic Landmarks Foundation since 1974, he has led its growth from a small organization focused mainly on preservation activities in Indianapolis to the largest statewide preservation organization in the nation. Historic Landmarks' emphasis now is on encouraging preservation of community heritage throughout Indiana, and its staff provides support to local preservation organizations through 5 regional offices. Among the assistance that Landmarks under Reid's leadership provides for preservation is a statewide preservation revolving loan fund to aid local organizations, several revolving funds for acquiring and preserving historic structures, a preservation services grant fund for feasibility studies, technical assistance by professional staff, and many publications on preservation techniques. In Indianapolis, Reid and Historic Landmarks have played a key role in the revitalization of such historic neighborhoods as Lockerbie Square, the Old North Side, Chatham Arch, Heron Morton Place, Ransom Place, and Fletcher Place. Landmarks also has exerted a major influence on modifying the design of the Circle Center Mall downtown in Indianapolis to include historic facades and to preserve the former Ellis Ayres and William H. Block Company department stores. And I must hasten to mention, since 1996, Historic Landmarks has taken on the largest private restoration effort in the country, the preservation of the West Baden Springs Hotel, a national historic landmark in southern Indiana, which has gotten a lot of coverage in the media. Tonight, Reid will speak to us on the topic, the coming of age of the Circle City, in which he will look at the past 25 years of revitalization in downtown Indianapolis and the role that historic preservation has played in that renewal. His lecture is part of the series of speakers this year on the theme, Celebrating the Circle City. Let's welcome Reid Williamson.
Well, Jim, you do me honor with those words, and for those of you who may not know in the audience, the last 30 years of Indianapolis's progress and preservation, the story thereof is very much seen with a heavy hand of Professor Glass in it. And his various capacities with the Preservation Commission there and Historic Landmarks and then with the state. And I think you all should know that, and I'll be touching on that as we work our way through. 30 years in a little over 50 minutes, not particularly easy, particularly when I will try to prove the statement that preservation fared well in that Midwestern city in the boom times of high progress and high development, and I hope you agree with me 50 some odd minutes from now. But the beginning started much more than 30 years ago with the founding of Indianapolis in 1820 at a site now commemorated with this plaque on a rock that still is by the White River where the first leaders of Indianapolis came. And 1 year later, hired away from Pierre L'Enfant after his Washington Commission, Alexander Ralston to lay out the then named a city of Indianapolis. And he took a mile by a mile each way and not only confected a rather rigid grid pattern, but also called for, hit the wrong button, folks, sorry, called for, there's my AV man here, I'm trying to get them both back on, and I'm pressing both forward. Turn the what? On this box here? Okay. I see both, on and off. There we are. Okay. I should have the other one too. As you can see, we've had no rehearsal with this equipment, and it's my ignorance and ineptness, not the equipment's fault, undoubtedly. Okay, now how'd you do that?
Those two buttons there.
Okay, I don't want to hit that. That's the one I want to hit. All right, good. And Ralston had the preciseness of saying where the great public buildings of Indianapolis should go. In fact, he said that the courthouse should be located where the city-county building, in fact, is today. And across the street, just to the north, the public market, located just where the city market is today. And if we flash forward from 1821 to 1998, one element of his plan has changed, and that is that the governor's residence no longer is on the Circle. No governor's wife wanted to live there because of the public presence of the location. And Governor Ray then lived in this house, now moved for its fourth time to the safe confines of Lockerbie Square. And we know now that the Circle does not have any residents, and in fact has what many consider to be literally the crossroads of not only the city and the state, but also of the nation, as Indianapolis adopted that grand motto some many years ago. And the idea of the Circle City comes forward with a look at that circle. So Ralston's plan has been preserved in three important instances, and his grid pattern has remained pretty much also intact. Lost America was a book published in the 1960s. and it sought to look at the buildings that had come down across the United States in the 50s and 60s in what I would call the demolition decades. The Indianapolis entries in Lost America are as many as you can find in any Midwestern city in this national search, including the Claypool Hotel, the old Marion County Courthouse, and some interesting edifices such as the women's restroom that many said should have been never erected on the then corner of Kentucky and Washington. And wonderful bridge, the old Emmerich's Bridge, no longer there, because after all this is a Lost America entry, and maybe the most significant loss of all, as published and as now reflected upon by preservationists, historians, and citizens alike, the old English theater on the Circle. It usually takes one significant building in an alert and aware but disgusted community to have that community galvanized. And when we lost this property in the early 60s and had commissioned by a native son, Nathaniel Owings of SOM, this international style J.C. Penney store, the public became concerned, which I will lead to in a minute. The transformation from the English building to this international to, I don't know what one would call this, we called it Darth Vader when it was first erected, to now the headquarters of the National Insurance Organization. Anthem shows the transformation over the last, since the last turn of the century. For you architects and designers, if you remember the English building in your mind's eye, this building is supposed to be reminiscent and complementary of it and complementary to it by certain of its design elements, including two towers on either side that the angle and perspective of this slide does not enable us to show. Other destruction during this age of demolition, wonderful old Indiana National Bank taken down for what many now call the Zipper Building, but most for surface parking lots. And Ed Zabrowski, then a friend of mine, had one of the most profitable demolition companies in the Midwest, and proudly erected a sign on the site of the gone, previously standing historic building that Zabrowski was here, taking that page out of a World War II cartoon. But because of this demolition, three things happened in the late 60s and early 70s. One, Historic Landmarks Foundation, although founded in 1960, was funded in 1969 by Mr. Eli Lilly with his personal fortune to stop what he and Herman Krannert, and interestingly enough, other business leaders, underline, other business leaders of the city of that day saw as rampant destruction of our cultural heritage. That organization had as its first mission, of course, in the early 60s, which was Preservation's Want, the saving, preservation, and restoration of the single standing house museum. Interestingly enough now, here pictured in the swath of the interstate that was being erected at the junction of I-70 and I-65 with the Crossroads of America proudly emblazoned in the Chamber of Commerce's letterhead. The organization then moved to Crown Hill Cemetery, where many of its critics thought it belonged anyway, of course, until the 1989, when a decision, and an awfully wise decision, was made to go where the action was, go downtown, to raise preservationists' visibility in the community, to make a strong statement in the hottest development area, which was the Lower Central Canal, and take the oldest building, move it out of harm's way, fix it up a bit first. And for those of you who are preservationists, this building still has no windows. That's Trump loyal treatment of each of the windows by, I think, rather a clever painting to depict open windows instead of forbidding plywood that you see in a screen to your left. And the first Heritage Preservation Center in the United States, and now the first and only Heritage Preservation Center, is here in Indiana, not in Virginia or Boston, Massachusetts, or Georgia, where one might think the only National Heritage Preservation Center might be. And with an eye towards the future and an answer to historic landmarks, one of historic landmarks oft asked questions by the general community: how do I add on to my old house and keep the design in a compatible manner? We tried to answer that with the pediment repetition in the new structure, the similarity of design and color and texturing of the exterior, and I'll leave it up to your discernment as to whether that challenge was successfly met or not. And as Jim says, it's my pleasure to work for an organization that was named only the second time with the best organization for historic preservation in the United States, given by the National Trust. But let's narrow down a little bit and talk not about the statewide interests, but about what happens in Indianapolis as a result of the demolition decades, and what has happened. And the operative term for our central regional office, located in the historic Kemper House, known formerly as the Wedding Cake House, is the use of a buy and sell program called FLIP, Fund for Landmark Indianapolis Properties, not as some preservation wag said at lunch the other day, free lunch for Indianapolis preservationists. The buy and sell routine and using real estate in commercial terms to advance preservation has been a strategy of this program, and particularly in the work that it has done in the residential historic districts throughout Indianapolis, which we'll visit in a minute. Also, at about this time, remember I said funded in '69, the city, under the leadership of Mayor Lugar, established the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. And here we see Ralston's Mile Square with the circle, of course, in the vortex. And their first assignment was historic Lockerbie Square, then thought to be a rather thought to be with its best results in some kind of an outdoor museum entitled Lockerbie Fair. But that was not to be. Praise the Lord, as we'll see later. In 1971, remember, three things happened about this time. The Meridian Street was protected from 40th north to the canal by the passage of a state statute that said that mansions such as the Josiah K. Lilly mansion that was once in the 1400 block of Meridian would no longer come down, and that this street, one of America's great streets, would remain with its mansions. Unlike Cleveland's Euclid Avenue, unlike Chicago's Prairie Avenue, and unlike Columbus's East Broad. So we had then, in the space of 3 years, with the Meridian Street program culminating, I should say, about 6 or 7 years ago as far as Historic Landmarks' direct involvement with the publishing of a book, Main Stem, dedicated to this marvelous volunteer, Alice Ross, who unfortunately is no longer with us, and using the age-old preservation strategy of placing a building in a book leads measurably towards the percentage of that building will be saved. In 1970, the city started on a historic preservation publication published later in 1972 through their planning department, their first effort, if you will, in looking at preservation as a public planning policy, in addition to the creation by Mayor Lugar of the Historic Preservation Commission. And over on the right, we see the planners then idea of what historic preservation was in that city some 25 years ago. And notice that each one of those buildings, those of you who are familiar with Indianapolis, are of course single standing and of monumental description and use. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which I love to say, particularly looking at this angle, Frank Lloyd Wright, having visited Indianapolis 27 years after his first visit, was asked if he remembered anything, and he said no, he really couldn't remember anything except that awful monument in the middle of the city. And he thought a minute and said, and I guess that's its purpose anyway, to remember. There were 2 losses in that 30 building list that I showed 2 slides ago. Today, 25 years later, the temple built as one of the first by our Jewish population, eventually inhabited by James Jones's congregation, and some say fired by his, as he was wont to do as he left various edifices behind in his trek to dishonor and infamy in Latin America. And the Manor Corps was demolished by a commercial firm for, as you probably might guess, a parking lot. But the other 28, if we look back, if we look ahead till today, still remain. Kind of a yardstick, at least in those 30 outstanding buildings reference of the measurement of preservation over the past quarter century in Indianapolis. I mentioned Lockerbie Fair, and we're taking a look now at a concept of creating in the downtown some kind of a mix between outdoor museum and a living neighborhood. Then this project was the first time that the Preservation Commission and the private group, Historic Landmarks, combined to pursue a strategy whereby the private organization would go into a neighborhood first, organize it, delineate the boundaries, so to speak, have the populace satisfied that historic districting was what was needed, and then have the Preservation Commission follow with a designation that then through city ordinance protects that district legally. In order to get there, however, in 1976, Lockerbie were populated with small workers' cottages that we can see here side by side, cheek to jowl, if you will, and three examples, was selected by the local preservation components as the headquarters for the centennial observation of the city. And as such, this building was restored and became the city headquarters for the bicentennial year of 1976 of the business leadership of that community. Significant for a number of reasons, none the least of which was that the business leadership had to go to Lockerbie, had to meet in this historic restored house, and by and by started getting the idea that these buildings were not slums, that they were historic renovation opportunities and could be a benefit to the city. The economics was sold as well, in as many speeches we could give to Rotary and Kiwanis and the like, that this was economic development, that there were investments in these properties, as we did see eyesore return to modern day livability. Eventually, this strategy grew, and the old north side was targeted next by this same succession of have the private preservation interests go in first, so to speak, use revolving funds, use the open meeting for, use the organizational abilities to get a neighborhood group started that would then welcome the protection, for instance, that their neighbors to the south, Lockerbie Square, had experienced by the protection by city ordinance. And so the march went on, if you will, in the residential areas where many in the 70s thought that these buildings that you see, that the depiction on the left was certainly fodder for demolition and not the end result that we enjoy today on the right. Chatham Arch was next, and finally now there are 12 protected districts throughout the city, the most recent being this past year, Ransom Place, and hold that, if you don't mind, for another Ransom Place in your mind for another 15 minutes because it has a significance later on in the program. And may I step aside now in the sequence of the preservation and progress growth of the city, and talk a little bit about what the Lockerbies and the Old North Sides are doing in modern day development. Here we see in the Lockerbie area new infill townhouses compatible with a general Lockerbie housing stock. and here a little bit further north in Chatham Arch. Well, this kind of example, this density of buildings side by side, they're vertical instead of a horizontal nature, sidewalks and trees have been adopted as the new urbanism or neo-traditional development, call it what you will. Indiana, I found out at dinner tonight, has several, and particularly in the northern part of the state, in Porter County. And here's one trying to get started in the Carmel area with the main public building, commercial buildings, the use of alleys, and the density of development. And mind you, this is a cornfield now right off of US 31 and 126. Some of you may, and I'm not sure that's in focus, at least it's not in focus to me, some of you may laugh at the idea of acquiring your historic style for your house. And one of my sharper associates pointed out that this is really a French Mansard Second Empire, not Italianate. But in the primary area of this development, you must select a historic style. Now, is that beneficial or not? I rather think it is. Because it spreads, again, what the real thing, why the real, why the real thing, I'm going to try to go back, thank God, why the real thing is important. Why, in looking at this as a copy of the real thing here in Indianapolis is important. Fake, some might say, but it's the same reason that, at least in my view, Joe Sixpack gets exposed to historic preservation prototypes in Disney World, whereby he might not if Old Town were not there. Row housing in the more dense of this West Clay Village, still in the planning stage, reminiscent, at least in my mind's eye, of a historic and authentic Georgetown house. Or look at this federal confection here of even a denser residential, how reminiscent it is of the real thing, the Grissamore House, a traditional early 1800s building that historic landmarks used to hold its to house its southern regional office. And in a lecture I attended by these developers, the one principal owner of which is one of Indianapolis's most ardent preservationists, by the way, Tom Charles Houston, to talk about sidewalks again. Here, sidewalks, tree plantings, and porches, all of which are picked up from, I'm losing my little pointer here, all picked up from what the preservationists have been saving all these years. And nearness to commercial within walking distance activities, why our commercial nodes in our historic districts are so important. But let me get back to my assignment. In 1975, the local chapter of the Indianapolis AIA published the book on Indianapolis architecture, which is where I had the pleasure of first meeting and working with Professor Glass. 20 years later, they looked at what had been published and published a sequel, if you will, in 1995, looking back at what had happened, what had transpired in those 20 years. And kind of like that Metropolitan Planning Development document I showed you, I think we have here in these two publications kind of another yardstick of how has preservation survived. Well, the recording is, one might say, mixed. I think it's a pretty good record. Maybe I'm paid to think that. But we did lose some significant buildings in those 20 years, such as the Hugh Manser building and its neighbors for the new Bank One tower. Other buildings that came down. Sorry. The Board of Trade also for that one bank building. So in one new development, we lost maybe four historic buildings. There are a dozen others that are mentioned in this sequel, including the Centennial Warehouse. But look at the slippery noodle next to it now, thanks to the Preservation Commission and some tax credit helps, finally restored as the oldest tavern, and still a darn good one, in downtown Indianapolis. The mall made a difference, made an impact both on demolition and renovation. And this 20-year span and this sequel publication picks up on the mall, the Circle Center Mall designed by the Simons for Indianapolis. Actually, the count, although it's hard to tell by this huge hole here, is pretty good. The mall made us suffer the demolition of 6 historic buildings. But, shall I say quickly, that 9 facades have been saved from buildings that were going to be demolished. We were told in 1979, the preservation community was that all 3 blocks of downtown had to go, and so we achieved a 16-year compromise until 1995 when only 6 total buildings were lost. But facades such as the Wilking, now a part of Nordstrom's, is maybe one of the most interesting aspects of this amalgamation of old into and alongside the new. Is it a successful amalgam? In my view, it is. Faced with the alternative of total demolition, it undoubtedly is. The Griffith block, seen here with its cladding coming off and some of its interior features now fully appreciated by the shopper, business, public, and, I might add, developer and city alike. In order to record what happened here, though, because we've moved some things around, and facades are facades and are not complete and not buildings, a very precise, comprehensive, and I think entertainingly informative program has been developed whereby from any viewshed virtually on any street along the 4 sides of the mall, one can see what was there, what is there now, and gauge, if you will, a opinion of what has occurred in this overall development by way of buildings. One of the things that I think as we have learned from a preservation meets development standpoint is that if preservationists are going to be successful and retain their credibility, they must understand what of what is going on and what the business is about that has created the problem. The business that was about that created the problem of a potential demolition of 14 buildings where we only lost 6 was a retail business. And we had to learn, therefore, that bridges were necessary. And the bridges that were first proposed were more like buildings across streets than bridges. But one way that we worked out the ability to not have 4 bridges, but just one, was what you know now as the Arts Garden, that serves as a bridge connecting 4 corners of 4 different blocks, but also, thanks to the Lilly Endowment's $12 million, is a performing and advertising center for the cultural arts in Indianapolis. In '76, the Tax Act had a profound effect on several of Indianapolis's downtown buildings. Looking at the positive side, festival marketplaces were springing up all over the country thanks to the 25% federal tax on rehabilitation of historic properties, and our Union Station was no different. Business leaders syndicated themselves and became preservationists, as evidenced by F.C. Tucker's executives restoring the Test Building, and residential living at a high-end market rate resulted also in the restoration of buildings and bringing more people downtown. On the negative side, and here finally, Tom Charles Houston, who I talked about developing the neo-traditional development, West Clay Village was one of the first Tax Act restores on Meridian Street with the restoration of the Morrison House. In 1985, a lawsuit filed against the state of Indiana, and including the governor's office, and including a subpoena to Lilly Endowment, did as much to verify that preservationists had to be taken seriously. And as a result of the consent decree of that lawsuit, several elements of the huge White River State Park are now to be preserved under preservationist aegis, including Military Park, and there's the McCormick Rock, denoting the founding place for Indianapolis. The old superintendent's building now being restored as the library and reception center for the NCAA's new headquarters. And my fourth and kind of last measure of preservation and progress and how, at least in my view, they've gone hand in hand, is the issuance of our 10 most endangered properties in the state. Since 1991, Indianapolis has had 5 entries, one of which is Busch Stadium, now which has been saved and is now used as a classic car automobile racing track. Indiana Oxygen Company, no longer wanted by Eli Lilly and Company, but needed to be moved off their campus, which made this move of this building resting here and now being converted into a restaurant the largest move of any one building in the country that year. And the Indiana Avenue buildings that remain, seen here in their before state, before publication of their listing on the 10 most endangered, again showing that placing a building in a book enhances its preservation possibilities. a pending loss. I will report bad news, is the loss of this industrial structure, the Cohiba building on the southern side of the city. Although to make way for Anthem's new campus and headquarters in the south side, we endeavored to show an alternative by incorporating, you'll notice here, the Cohiba building, both on the top and on the bottom, into their overall development. But because the development was sold to a California REIT before we could enter, our efforts there were unsuccessful. And a loss of the important part of a corner in Ransom Place, and I asked you to hold that name in your mind because Ransom Place has become for Indianapolis our preservation symbol of minority heritage, targeted by the Flip Fund for restoration and renovation, as seen here in before and afters. It has allowed our African American community to participate, shall we say, fully in the benefits, the retention of their cultural heritage, now proudly advertised as in one way as a black heritage corridor featuring Indiana Avenue that you saw first and the Madam Walker building with the Ransom Place neighborhood immediately to the rear. The second oldest extant African American neighborhood, Fayette Street, is an example in the in the early 90s, after our current mayor came into office, of a consolidation whereby buildings that were scattered in a scattered site situation were pulled into a neighborhood side by side, opening up the rest of the area vacated by the move of this building from its original site to its current site for redevelopment, at the same time retaining a neighborhood sense along this two-block area. Another example of a building moved to save it, and there were some 23 of these that were done in this area. With the intention of elevating, if you will, the whole African American minority experience into the city's preservation movement. In the few minutes that I do have left, I want to tell you that, at least in my view, the city has been as responsible as many others, and maybe even more. When I say city, I mean capital C, and I'm talking about City Hall. When the Market Square Arena was erected in the late 1960s, now about to be pulled down because it's being replaced by the Conseco Fieldhouse 30 years later, both of these huge developments did not have a significant impact on the historic resources of the city, nor did the erection of the huge RCA Dome, our football arena, or the expansion of the convention center, which is now in its third expansion program. Furthermore, on a positive side, Indianapolis as a city, started by Mayor Lugar, in these last 30 years, has acquired historic properties that were abandoned, shall we say, by commercial for-profit interests. The first being Union Station, now still owned by the city, unfortunately now dark and looking for a new use that we think will be a public banquet and meeting hall. Next came the acquisition under the Hudnut administration of the Indiana Theater, that had a demolition permit already written upon it when the city stepped in and rescued the building, now home of the Indiana Repertory Theater. And City Market, remember, still in its location, where Ralston said the public market should be in 1821 owned by the city. All projects, I might say, to the city's perseverance and therefore credit are not money makers. And I know Professor Glass's favorite, the L.S. Ayres building, now housing both the Parisian retail outlet and the USA Group, a large business moving downtown with its employees. And my last example of city stepping up where the private sector has not, these properties along Washington Street. Well, for particularly those younger preservationists in our midst, my last 10 slides at 50 minutes into the program, a look at the future a bit. What, in looking back, if you agree with my 50-minute ago hypothesis that preservation fared well, at least held its own during this 30-year boom time in downtown Indianapolis, what can we learn and take forward into the new millennium? The first is organize, organize, organize. Create neighborhood groups. Yes, even commercial neighborhood groups to exert political influence, to have their wishes known, and then the retention of that neighborhood becomes the neighborhood's program, not City Hall's program, not the private preservation interest program, but the ownership remains where it should be with the owners. And in the residential sense of organizing, the creation of more living units, more livability downtown becomes more important. And through the Central Regional Office, a neighborhood representative coalition called acronym HUNY, Historic Urban Neighborhoods of Indianapolis, has been formed, an organization of other organizations. And I just don't think you can layer on too much of this to get citizen involvement the right way on behalf of the proper balance of preservation and progress. And speaking of livability and retaining the livability of a center city, the great spread that we're now having, both in wealth, the poor and the rich, and also in age, the young and the graying generation can offer opportunities for, in this case, an affordable housing project of 6 abandoned, uninhabited, and uninhabitable buildings for our less wealthy members of the population. And these, in this building, formerly YWCA, now being converted to a single-room occupancy for the elderly. 2 examples of historic buildings, in this case, count them, 1 and then 5 here, 6, being brought back to handle that, the living in the cities, back to the city element of preservation needs, but also realistically the difference that we are getting in our society now, unfortunately, of the haves and the have-nots, the youngest and the eldest amongst us. Third, activity downtown. Our Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, a magnet for cultural activity in social and cultural circles in Indianapolis, like in most good-sized towns, out in the suburbs, attracted back downtown, right on the circle to the now newly named Hilbert Circle Theater. that kind of vitality, both in cultural and in retail, as we saw in the Circle Center Mall, athletic, as we've seen in new buildings, domes, and Conseco field houses, all, I think, lead to a preservation success as well. And there must be open space and greenery. Here, a rather off-putting, actually a militaristic military drill field in the 50s and 60s, now converted to a much more friendly sylvan setting in the heart of the city. Office buildings as the fourth caution, their attention by important conversions through tax credits or other incentives. This Circle building built in 1930, the last building to be built until 1950 on the Circle, and Nathaniel Owings designed the Penny Building, as I said. And now we're in another gap where these second-class office buildings need help, or we're going to lose those as well. And I think incentives are called for here as we confect more from our state legislature to do the same. And lastly, a caution on kind of the commercial fad of the day. Remember the malls that were created and malls within our inner cities of blocking streets, keeping traffic out, being very directive to pedestrian and automobile alike. Now being ripped out, thank God, in so many of our communities. South Bend has got ripped out theirs. Richmond's ripping out theirs. Evansville's considering doing the same thing. But a huge fad that killed many of our downtown main streets in the 50s. And then the shopping centers outside of town that started to suck out the life of particularly our commercial life from our downtown, that are now, according to the Urban Land Institute, losing their luster, and the return to downtown by major chains is starting to take place. And 10 years ago, it was the drive-in bank. Where every bank had to have not only a facility in Center City, but had to have a drive-in facility. And what that meant was buildings being cleared, of course, for parking, let alone for the maneuverability of an automobile into the drive-in outlet itself. And now we're faced with yet another, what I call commercial fad of the day, and that's the huge drugstore chains of this country taking, in this case, wanting to take historic a corner building that luckily our flip fund was able to buy before they could tear it down, put up the parking, and their, in this case, CVS, although that's not the only national drug chain doing this to many of our downtowns and center cities. And finally, and with thanks very much for this invitation, I want you to know, and I'll say this without apology, I've aspired to be a part of your fall lecture series. May I urge continued emphasis on planning and public policy, and we're seeing that happen now as we work against the sprawl that seems to be sucking the life and threatening the inner cities, of which this look at the last 30 years of Indianapolis was all about. Thanks, Jim.
Could we have the lights for just a minute? I think we should allow our audience to ask at least one or two questions in this extensive talk. Thank you, Reid. This was a marvelous review of a lot of changes in Indianapolis, but also how preservation forces saved a great deal of the heritage in downtown Indianapolis. Let's take one or two questions. Anyone?
Everybody wants to go to the reception. Oh.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yes, I think generally it's good to take them out. I thought that closing of that particular area, downtown Main Street, proved it didn't help things. We saw vacancies, did we not? Are you from Richmond, sir? No. Oh. Well, in my view, this gentleman just lived there, and we saw after an initial surge when they were put in after that unfortunate explosion and tragedy, a declination, a diminishing of activity and therefore renewal. And I think we've experienced that in these other cities that are now going back to where that street was the original street, and the storefronts on those streets are succeeding now as well.